In this video, we combine some of the most terrifying cave diving disasters we've covered on this channel. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to leave a subscription for more exciting cave diving documentaries like these.
Sterkfontein is one of the most important areas for paleontology and anthropology research. Otherwise known as Strong Spring, this remote African cave system is a treasure trove of ancient humans and our distant ancestors. But one brave explorer fell prey to Sterkfontein's death trap: underwater caves that have been killing humans for millennia. Today, we're covering the race against time to rescue a Sterkfontein cave diver that turned into a marathon that shocked the caving world back in the 80s. Sterkfontein, otherwise known as Strong Spring, is a limestone cave system at the World Heritage Site known as the Cradle of Humankind. The Cradle of Humankind is located 31 miles north of Johannesburg, which is the 26th largest city in the world and the capital of the wealthiest province in South Africa. The Cradle of Humankind was created to study the area and to protect the land. It's a haven for paleontologists and archaeologists. Paleontologists study fossils to uncover how animals lived in different periods of time, and archaeologists study the ancient cultures of our ancestors. Researchers in the region are most interested in researching homonyms, or the branch of evolution that humans came from. Research at the Cradle of Humankind is mostly done in two ways: the Maropeng and Sterkfontein. The first human-ape fossils found at the Cradle of Humankind were discovered in the Sterkfontein caves in 1935 by Robert Broom, a medical doctor and paleontologist who made a number of valuable discoveries. In the Maropeng cave, 92 different hominid species have been discovered. A single chamber in Sterkfontein, the Dinaledi chamber, houses over 1,500 fossils from the Homo naledi species of humans. No other site in Africa has as many fossils from any one species. In total, over 90,000 fossils have been unearthed here, and roughly 40,000 of the world's ancestral fossils have been found exclusively at Cradle of Humankind. Out of the two caves, Maropeng is open to visitors with a museum that showcases the skeletal fossils and the ancient tools that were used by our ancestors. The museum also has a tour of Maropeng that extends into Sterkfontein, and the tour also lets visitors see active excavations. The Sterkfontein or Strong Spring caves are made of dolomitic limestone dating back over 20 million years. The dolomite portion of the cave dates back 2.58 billion years, where the region was at the bottom of a sea. But the modern caves began forming when weak acids in rainwater were absorbed by the porous limestone, which eventually carved out tunnels and chambers. Some of the spots where rainfall collected on the surface became massive potholes, and animal bones built up at the bottom of these vertical shafts after they unknowingly fell in or died and were thrown in over the years. Different portions of the cave have different entrances, including a massive hole leading to the big cave portions, while the Windgat portion has a narrow 40-foot deep chimney hole for its entrance. The Windgat portion of Sterkfontein has some of the most impressive speleothems in the caves, with massive stalagmites, huge flowstone, curvy mountains, and crystallized ferns. Wildlife species also inhabit the cave, including the petiolata wasps that swarm on the cave ceilings and create colonies much like ants with special social roles. The caves at Sterkfontein were first used as limestone mines almost a half a century before Robert Broom uncovered the first ape fossils at the Cradle of Humankind. The limestone was covered with lime, which was used to process gold. Dynamite blasts from the miners eventually revealed the entrance to the cave system. In 1890, the first non-human fossils were discovered in the caves. World War II put a halt to the excavation at Sterkfontein, but Dr. Broom came back later to find Mrs. Pless, a nearly intact skull from the species Australopithecus africanus, which was only recently redacted when new research uncovered the skull was from a male. While a number of important discoveries have been made at Sterkfontein, the cave has also been the site of international disasters. In 1984, Sterkfontein caves were world-renowned, but they weren't under as much control as they are now. It would be another 15 years before the cave got protected status under the new governing body of the Cradle of Humankind. In recent years, South Africa has also enacted laws to preserve its caves, making it illegal to harm or take portions of caves without permission. That year, in 1984, 29-year-old Peter Verhulsel explored the cave with a group of 2 of his friends. They were going cave diving in the Cradle of Humankind. In cave diving, there's one important rule: never let go of the guideline. Some guidelines are attached to the rock itself to provide a permanent safety measure for anyone diving in the cave. The only reasonable time anyone would let go of these lines would be during missions to lay new guidelines in the first place. This task can't be done by novice or even advanced divers. Permanent guidelines in underwater caves should only be set by experts in the field with proper equipment. More commonly, divers will use distance lines, which can be held in the hand and clipped onto scuba gear for added safety. The other end can be attached to a surface marker buoy for divers traveling roughly 160 feet, while exploration reels used for official or expert survey work can be bulky and hold over 2,000 feet of line. Cave divers usually need multiple reels that need to be attached to checkpoints. The guidelines themselves are made of white nylon, which provides the best visibility in low light and enough strength and buoyancy for most situations. Some deep cave dives require divers to map out the placement of various temporary guidelines. Teams will make knots or use line markers to mark different distances along the route. Cave reels use adjustable drag so that the line can be recovered or laid down at swimming speed. Divers of any experience level should carry safety spools, which can be used in an emergency, like if the line breaks. Cave divers have to keep tension on their own guidelines at all times to avoid snagging the line on sharp rocks or wrapping the line around other divers. Divers laying permanent lines have to be aware of the space to ensure the line is visible at all times. Sometimes, inexperienced divers will fit through a narrow hole and lay down the guiding line through the hole. But if they're skinny or small in stature, they might not realize that other people can't follow the line. They also might not realize how the passage travels in the opposite direction. If the hole is too narrow to pass through for most people, or if the return trip is too dangerous, these amateur lines become line traps, and they can easily kill. On September 29, 1984, Peter Verhulsel followed behind his 2 friends. He wasn't as experienced as his friends, so he should have been in the middle, where the 2 could watch him, but they kept him in the back, trailing behind. Unfortunately, Peter ignored the safety rules for cave divers. He only brought a single light and 1 scuba tank or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, and he only brought 1 light source. It's always smart to carry at least 1 smaller emergency tank, if not a full-sized backup. Small emergency tanks can be placed on the arm, back, side, or the stomach of divers. These units are separated from the main tank, and divers have to activate the emergency tanks so that they don't drain during normal use. Of course, this was the 80s, when equipment wasn't as good, and the dangers of caving weren't broadcast to the whole world online. Peter and his friends were diving in the ancient recesses of the Sterkfontein caves when Peter let go of the guideline. Without a guideline of his own, he took off to explore a side passage. His friends waited. Unable to speak underwater, they eventually signaled in silence. One by one, they followed in his direction. Darkness surrounded them, with only algae-covered rock in all directions. After a few heart-pounding minutes, they found Peter and took him back to the guideline. A few minutes later, and Peter's adventurous side took over once more. He veered off from the guideline, and his fins kicked up slit as he swam into a dark tunnel. His friends took chase and grabbed him, nearly pulling him back to the path and back to the tenuous safety of the bright white nylon rope. They kept advancing through the flooded ventricles of the Cradle of Humankind. Peter felt more confident after being found twice, and, without signaling to his friends, he swam off a 3rd time into the unknown. This time, his friends kept swimming. Eventually, they paused and turned around to find Peter had vanished. After the distance they had traveled, there were many passages he could have gone through. So they tried waiting. They kept waiting, and after uncomfortable minutes, greeted only by the sounds from their own eerie breathing and their ever-increasing heart rate pounding in their ears, After they waited for what felt like an eternity in the flooded tubes below an African fossil field, the other two divers grabbed their safety spools and backtracked. The two divers couldn't move quickly because their safety guidelines had to be accounted for. They couldn't let out too much at once, they couldn't take sharp turns, and they had to be wary of each other to avoid getting tangled. Eventually, they got warning signs that their oxygen was low. The two friends had no choice but to head back to the surface. After a frantic escape from the strong spring, they immediately called for rescue teams. Heroic rescuers made the dive. Nothing. They ventured deeper with more guidelines to explore the side routes. No sign of Peter. He had simply disappeared. Eventually, hope ran out for finding their friend alive, but they kept trying and switched the focus to a recovery effort. After 6 weeks of searching, the bulk of the rescue team packed up and went home. A few divers weren't deterred by the main operation ending. They kept diving. Eventually, they found a hole leading out of the main cave, which led out of the sump and onto walkable pathway. They found footprints in the muddy waters of this deep, dark crevice. In an island in the distance, they found Peter crumpled up on the ground, dead. Peter Verhulsel joined the thousands of ancient humans who also died in the cave. An autopsy revealed he had survived 3 weeks in perpetual darkness. It wasn't oxygen or exposure that got him, but rather he died of starvation while desperately awaiting rescue. Nearby, they found a message in the sand Peter had scrawled, addressed to his wife and his mother, where he wrote how much he loved them. In another sad twist to the story, the cradle of humankind closed the underground lake portion of the cave, so no surveyors can explore the depths of Sterkfontein and the full depth of the cave. One of humanity's most important archaeological sites remains unknown. Out of all of the possible caves, underwater caves like those at Sterkfontein are by far the most deadly. While rocks can collapse or people can get lost, there are way more dangers with diving, and it's nearly impossible to survive a mistake. Peter's death was tragic, but it also inspired divers to remember the importance of guidelines. His last message was seared into the hearts and minds of cavers everywhere. A harsh reminder to bring backups and make safety the top priority.
In 1995, 5 members of the Rensselaer Outing Club traveled to the wilderness in New York State to venture into a mysterious cave that spelunkers couldn't fully explore for over 100 years after its discovery. As they advanced, they found a tight labyrinth of stone that was nearly totally submerged in chilling water. With only a few inches of air to breathe, one caver made a disastrous mistake. A heroic, life-saving battle ensued, and the woman who famously walked with a broken leg to aid in her own rescue climbed down into the abyss once more to help these trapped cavers just 4 years after her own harrowing incident. Would she get there in time to save them? Keep listening to find out how this wild tale unfolds. Clouded sky shrouded the midday sun as wind groaned through the barren trees just outside the town of Skohari. Earlier on that October morning, light snow dusted the forest. But by the time the cavers reached the edge of the wilderness, the only evidence of precipitation was a partially soaked floor of leaves that squished beneath their boots as they hiked to a cave in the James Gage Karst Preserve. This caving trip was planned by a club at America's oldest technological research university, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. They brought full-body wetsuits to provide an insulating layer in the cold waters of the cave, and they also brought packs with food, water, and 2 backup lights in addition to their main headlamps or handheld lights. The party were no strangers to the outdoors, and even though it was under 50 degrees outside that day, and likely even colder in the shaded tunnels below ground, they felt ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The members of the group were Eric Kirkner, Sarah Cutler, Thomas Howe, Joe Bailly, and Scott Stepanuk. Scott was likely the leader of the group, having been a lifelong member of the National Speleological Society. Scott was also a canoe racer, which was a skill that could be useful in Ball's Cave, otherwise known as Gage Cave. The cavern is named for its old owner, Simeon Ball, who discovered it in 1831, although some accounts call it Gage after the preserve it's found on today. After a short hike, the group came to a hill in the woods with a rocky outcropping and a crack that slid into the darkness. By the time they reached the cave, it was 6 p.m. and the temperature was dropping. Over the next few hours, the air above ground would plummet to barely above freezing. But they weren't going to let that stop them from exploring the lost passage of Gage Cave. The entrance to Gage Cave is a 75-foot straight drop that free hangs above the darkness. The group looped their ropes around nearby trees and anchored them to the ground, and began their descent down the wet, mud-covered walls of the cave. Gage Cave now has a rugged ladder that descends to a small divot in the wall where cavers have to transition to a second huge ladder bolted to large wooden reinforcement beams at varying heights, though cavers are expected to tie off at the surface for safety. Near the bottom of the vertical shaft, a small rocky ledge stuck out at around the same area as the hole. Then, after touching boot to stone, the passage took a steep decline for another 30 feet before reaching a second, shorter vertical drop. After completing the second climb in the chilly air of the cave, the group splashed into a slow stream that coursed throughout the whole cave. Their wetsuits protected them at this early stage when the stream started around 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep. But after a decent walk, the stream sinks into 30-foot wide subterranean lakes. Ball's Cave contains at least 14 different underground lakes, and the main water passage extends around 2 miles, with a max depth of around 200 feet below ground. Past cave trips used a small boat to traverse the stream, and this group could have used one of the boats, or they may have brought their own canoe. They may have even swam through the lakes in their wetsuits. But there are no accounts of how they completed this first section of the cave. As they progressed through the winding chambers, they marveled at the limestone walls, uniformly covered in small lines that mark layers of bone and sediment that built up gradually over millennia to form the magnificent structure they were exploring. The air was icy as they crossed the large lakes beyond the entrance. After a long journey, they reached a walking section that went to a room called the Amphitheater, which had 100-foot tall walls and massive speleothems. Advancing further, they used ropes to descend a hole at the end of the next passage. There, the outing club found themselves in the Square Room, where water trickled down the rocks, forming little steps. Following the slope down brought them to a corner with a small pool and a tiny, almost invisible arch that hung just above the spot where the walls meet with the cloudy water. This spot was the end of the cave for about 100 years. No caver dared explore the tiny river passage until scuba and cave technology advanced enough to protect them as they explored the passage. They weren't the first to go through the Lost Passage in Ball's Cave, but they were among a small group of trailblazers who braved the claustrophobic tunnel. This passage is known as the low airspace section, since that minuscule triangular dome of rock is the only space cavers have for air as they crawl along with frigid water up to their ears throughout the whole passage. The cavers had to practically lay on their backs, moving feet first, almost totally parallel with the floor, with just their necks bent upright to stay out of the water. One by one, they filed into the narrow tube. They were all able to fit, and at the beginning, they could all keep their faces above water. But as they progressed, they ran into an unexpected problem. Each movement created waves, which would be barely noticeable for small groups, but with this fairly large group, each wave crashed into one another, creating higher waves that reached the ceiling, splashing into the cavers, covering their faces, and making it even harder to breathe. The constructive interference of the waves wasn't the only problem they had to face. More people breathing produces more carbon dioxide, which could quickly suck all the oxygenated air out of the room and suffocate them if they moved too slowly or if they got stuck. The splashing waters slowed the lead caver's pace, which caused all the others to bunch up behind them, making the waves even worse and causing everyone to wait in practically ice-cold waters. Their wetsuits weren't designed to block waters this cold for this long. They weren't even out of the passage when they felt the cold begin to sap the life from their limbs. Thankfully, they were able to traverse this section without any major incidents, and after 2 hours below ground, they reached the battle room. They were all varying levels of cold as they exited the low air section, some worse than others. Beyond the low air section, The cave expanded into walkable sections, with long, spiky rock jutting out along the lengths of the chamber to signify old water height marks. Advancing even deeper into the cave, the water got deeper again, but the walls widened, becoming something like a sewage drain that they had to wade through. The bitter waters once again stole more heat from their bodies as they advanced. Further down, some of the rooms were stripped bare of the delicate limestone formations that made them so unique, as landowners broke them down and sold them to collectors and museums. After lamenting the destruction of the cave and completing their goals, the Rensselaer Outing Club turned around to leave Gage Cave behind. Now, to avoid another battle to breathe in the low air section, they decided to enter the waterlogged passage one person at a time to avoid sitting around in the frigid water and to avoid creating too many waves. The waters were high, but not unbearable for the first length of the return trip, but partway down, it would turn into the low air passage. Since the cavers would lose sight of each other along the winding length of the tunnel, they planned to signal with a yell when each member reached the low airspace portion to give each person just enough space to get through without wasting too much time. They picked Sarah to go first because she was the coldest. If she didn't go through it first, she might not be strong enough to complete the exit climbs after waiting around for the others to get ahead. Sarah hesitated as she braced herself for the shocking cold of the water. After a moment, she waded into the long tunnel and disappeared into the distance. After a few minutes, she reached the low air section and yelled to the group. As she sat down to complete the tunnel, she realized the water level had risen, making the passage even more cramped. It was hard to see since she was basically facing the ceiling the entire time, and she wasn't familiar with this cave and its routes. Still, she began her crawl through the tunnel. That was Scott's cue to begin his crossing. Pushing through the water, Scott felt tension well up inside him as he approached the low airspace. He dreaded seeing Sarah stuck in the water. Or worse. She wasn't stuck on this side of the passage, which was a good sign. However, when Scott emerged from the square room, Sarah wasn't there. Meanwhile, back at the group, they heard the distant echo of Scott's yell. It was faint, but Joe took it as his cue, and prepped his mind and body, and he descended into the water for his turn to cross. Following a chain of signals, Thomas and Eric also took their turns. However, when the last in line, Eric Kirkner, reached the low air section, he found Thomas still waiting on this side. Thomas relayed the game of telephone to Eric, telling him that Sarah was missing, and Scott went further into the square room to look for her. Scott's yell wasn't the signal to send Joe, he was trying to warn them that Sarah had vanished. Thomas and Eric went back to the low air passage to look for any sign of her. Sarah didn't realize it, but she had had two options for exiting the low air section. She could turn down an S-shaped tunnel or go straight. The straight route didn't lead to the exit, and it was blocked by a sump, a place where the low air section of the cave had become a no air section as the ceiling fell below the water level, creating a totally submerged passage. Eric and Thomas both followed the straight passage, not realizing it was submerged, and when they got to the sump, their hearts sank. They quickly turned back to the square room. Earlier, Sarah had assumed that the higher waters had flooded the exit, so she free dove the first sump, holding her breath and opening her eyes in the murky waters of the cave until she got to a small pocket of air. But on the other side, the cave sumped again. She was already the coldest of the group, and finally submerging herself made her temperature drop even more. She took a few short gasps of air and dove under the second sump. This time, she emerged into a room. She thought she had made it back, but as she climbed out of the water, she realized it wasn't the square room. Sarah yelled in the cold, dark chamber, but got no response. As fear and cold started to twist her mind and body, she went back into the water and tried to dive under the sumps to find her way back, but the waters were too cold. Her body was too stiff, and her muscles were shivering and unable to perform the deft maneuvers she needed to survive the flooded sections. She managed to reverse in the tube of rock and return to the unknown room where she would wait, freezing and alone. Around this time, Scott was ending his search and returning to the square room. As he double-checked for any holes or any signs of her walking away, he heard a cry from Sarah, who attempted contact once more after returning to her trapped room. Scott followed her voice and found that she was in a room below the group, but the passage was blocked by heavy boulders that had broken down from the ceiling ages ago. Eric and Thomas got back to the square room to meet the others, and Scott informed them what had happened. Thomas knew that the route had sumped, but since Sarah got through it and he was comparatively warmer, he volunteered to follow Sarah's route, thinking that together they could find a way to safety. He went back down the S-tunnel, reached the first sump, held his breath, and dove beneath the waters. The first sump was unexpectedly long. He couldn't find the air, so he swam faster, his heart racing as he fought the urge to breathe in the cold, dark waters of James Gage Cave. As his cheeks swelled, trying to hold back a breath, he reached the air pocket. After coughing and gasping in the small pocket of air, Thomas collected himself and dove the second sump. As he surfaced, he found Sarah on a ledge above the water, eating some food to regain some of her strength. Thomas reached her, and the pair discussed the situation. He immediately realized it was too dangerous to go back. They were both stuck in this side room, cold and isolated. After a back-and-forth shouting match through the rubble, Thomas informed the others that they were trapped. Eric, Joe, and Scott debated their options. They didn't want to immediately call for help. Instead, they brainstormed ways to help. They could either dig through the rubble or get scuba gear to help them through the sumps. However, going back for scuba gear would take far too long, and there was no way they could dig through the rubble on their own. After weighing their options, they realized that they had to get help to save Sarah and Thomas. Eric decided to stay in the cave to lend any support he could to the stranded cavers, while Scott and Joe would exit Ball's cave to get help. Joe and Scott flew through the rest of the cave and exited a little over an hour after they left the room. Once above ground, they walked to the nearest house where they could call for help, a house owned by Emily Mobley, the same Emily who, just 4 years prior, aided in her own rescue during a 4-day-long operation after a boulder broke her lower leg in the 1,604-foot-deep, 54-mile-long Lechugia Cave. After spending a long time trying to figure out Sarah's location and planning what to do, the sun had set, and it was getting late. Scott and Joe knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Eric rummaged through his pack to find any pieces of metal he could use to hit the rocks and begin digging through the breakdown as fast as he could, splitting the rock and shoveling dirt and gravel out of the way. Through sheer force of will, Eric created a 15-inch triangular hole in breakdown. He made contact with Sarah and Thomas, and they tried to squeeze through the hole, but even Sarah, the lighter of the two, was unable to fit through the hole. Scott and Joe went further into the town and called the sheriff's office. Then they went back to Emily's and continued to try to wake her. By the time an ambulance arrived, Emily had finally woken up to help with the rescue. She suited up and brought a pack with extra clothes, heat packs, and food. While emergency personnel were waiting for cave rescuers, Emily climbed down the ladder and into the cave alone. Living just a stone's throw away from the cave gave Emily an advantage. She knew the Gage Cave like the back of her hand, so she quickly got to the square room to aid Sarah and Thomas. Using the hole Eric had dug, she delivered the care packages, and without wasting any time, she knelt down and helped Eric dig in the square room. After the minutes rolled by, Emily got concerned. She only led the charge back into Ball's cave because she thought Scott and Joe were coming back to help dig. But as time dragged on, there was no sight of the others. It turned out the rescue crew and the others had thought Emily was going to come back to the surface after analyzing the situation. Then she could tell the teams exactly what kind of tools they needed to bring to help blast through the rubble. This whole situation emphasizes the importance of communication and the role of the controller or warden during cave rescues. Had a controller taken command of the situation immediately, they could have all been on the same page, which would have made the operation faster and far less worrisome for everyone involved. It's problems like these that turn rescues into body recoveries. Caving guidelines were still progressing back in the 90s, so rapid assessment of controllers wasn't guaranteed. And there were other assumptions that made the above-ground crew jump to conclusions. Past standards preferred written communication to pass accurate information between different parties. Today, with field phones, people can verbally communicate, allowing the receiver to write down and consolidate any necessary information, which can then be passed on through a chain of command instead. If they had planned to use phones, a second crew would have entered the cave even if Emily wasn't returning to the surface. But instead, the above-ground team was stalled. Emily and Eric dug through the dirt and grime and hammered the boulders with all their might, but they were struggling. Emily was still tired from only a few hours of sleep, and Eric was cold and exhausted. After a few hours, the pair managed to crack one of the larger pieces of stone, sending its rubble crashing to the floor below, and its crumbling sent another stone crashing to the floor with an echoing thump. With the hole expanded, Sarah and Thomas felt that they could get through, but it was just a little too high for them to reach now that the structure of the rock had changed. Working together without safety harnesses to keep them tethered to the floor above, Emily and Eric reached down into the tunnel, grasped Sarah's hands, and pulled her to the ledge of the hole. Sarah gripped the rock and pushed with all of her might as the pair helped her to safety on the floor of the square room above. After taking a moment to breathe, they repeated the process with Thomas and got them both up to relative safety. But they still had to exit the remaining distance of James Gage Cave, and they were worried about the above-ground crew. They still had no idea where they were. A cave-in or flood could be blocking the exit. But there was only one way to find out. They moved slowly as their stiff bones ached in the icy waters. After what felt like an endless hike, the group saw lights approaching. They gave some banter, assuming it was the rest of the Rensselaer Club, but the approaching lights weren't from Joe and Scott. The rescue team had finally reached the cave and gone inside. The approaching rescuers paused the group to give a medical assessment. They were in bad shape, but since they had made it this far, Eric, Thomas, and Sarah were cleared to exit on their own accord. They continued to move toward the surface together. Sarah and Thomas were both very weak, so the rescue team helped them up some of the final climbs using ropes and harnesses to keep them safe. After hours of struggle, all members of the team made it out of Ball's Cave alive. Thomas and Sarah rode in the ambulance to stay in a nearby hospital where they were treated for hypothermia. Eric may have joined them, since even though he didn't go through the sumps, he had stayed in near freezing temperatures with the trapped cavers. Some of the members of that group may have hung up their headlamps and boots for good, but others kept on caving. Scott became a scholarship judge for the National Cave Rescue Commission and an instructor in the Northeast Mobile Search and Rescue Team, where he learned from past events like this one to help other cavers who found themselves in dire situations. Now, even with rising oceans, Gage Cave hasn't flooded yet. Would you dare to travel through the low air passage? Let us know in the comments section. Click the like button if you enjoyed this crazy true story of some of caving's most legendary figures. Bell Island is a small island in Newfoundland, the easternmost province in Canada. In 2007, mostly outside of the public spotlight, the island witnessed one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of underwater cave diving, and one of the sport's most shocking deaths. This is the story of the ill-fated international mission to explore Bell Island's abandoned mines. The story begins decades earlier. Around the turn of the 20th century, Bell Island became an invaluable resource thanks to its large deposits of iron ore. Mining companies, such as the Nova Scotia Steel and Coal Company, developed a major mining site on the island. They called the site Wabena. Even today, Wabena remains the main settlement on the island, and it's where the vast majority of its residents live. Bell Island and its Wabena mine reached arguably their peak of international importance during World War II. The Allies heavily protected the island, and it was even attacked by German submarines in 1942. This unsuccessful attack would go on to be known as the Battle of Bell Island. After World War II, the island experienced a steep economic decline. By April of 1966, all of Bell Island's mine shafts were closed. Although the island remains densely populated, its population has been slowly decreasing ever since. In the early 2000s, Newfoundland's Department of Tourism knew that something had to be done to remedy the province's enduring economic woes. Opening Bell Island's abandoned mines and underwater shipwrecks to international tourism was one of the ideas put forward. But, in order to potentially open them to the general public, the sites first had to be explored and analyzed by professionals. No one had visited the shipwrecks or traveled down the closed mine shafts in decades. Local officials knew that to ensure the safety and security of visitors, they needed expert assistance. This takes us to the formation of the mission. In the summer of 2004, the Bell Island Heritage Society granted permission to a select team of international divers to begin exploring the Bell Island mine. They were Eric Van Dorn, Steve Lewis, Debbie Stanley, and her husband Rick Stanley. Steve Lewis, who later wrote a book about the mission, describes their first dive as, quote, nothing more than a quick splash. Their goal at this early stage was to find out if diving the abandoned mine was even possible to begin with. They were given an old map from back when the mine was still in use. The map covered several square kilometers of underground tunnels and chambers. In theory, the mine should still look roughly the same as the old map, but at the time, nobody knew. There could have been major cave-ins, or there could be prohibitively poor visibility, or blockades. There was only one way to find out. After meeting at the entrance to the long-abandoned mine, the group strapped on all their equipment, including heavy-duty cave lights for each cave diver, and, perhaps after saying a quick prayer, they plunged into the cold, uncharted darkness. Lewis describes what they saw on that first dive as a, quote, dusty museum. The long, gradually downsloping tunnel that had previously been traversed by minecarts was now filled with water. This tunnel was designated by the map as the number 2 shaft. Lewis and his fellow explorers swam down the number 2 shaft, descending many meters in no time. They soon reached an intersection and turned left, discovering what looked to Lewis like a stable for horses, now eerily submerged and ghostly empty. The group also came across tons of machinery and tools. They even found a pair of boots. Haunted but intrigued by their findings, the group eventually made their way back out of the mine and onto dry land. Stunned, they slowly lumbered uphill with their heavy equipment. Rick Stanley began going on excitedly about how the mine was spectacular, that there was stuff everywhere, that it was fantastic, and that he needed a rum. Above water, at the main staging area, there was another large map of the mine on the wall. Lewis says they traced the distance they had covered and found that it was, in his words, quote, a tiny L-shaped squiggle. Despite all they had already seen, the group had barely even begun to explore the extent of this enormous underwater museum. One thing was clear to everybody involved. Further exploration was definitely warranted. In light of the promising success of their initial mission, Lewis and the others were soon joined by a team of divers and surface support volunteers. Having proven the mine was indeed diveable, at least for professionals, the next mission involved 12 divers total. Steve Lewis was chosen to be the leader of this larger, more thorough expedition. On February 1st, 2007, the team began what was intended to be a 10-day series of dives throughout the Bell Island mine. Lewis, along with underwater photographer Vlada Dakina, went in first. Initially, the mine was exactly how Lewis remembered it. But upon descending further, visibility started to worsen. Thick silt the color of iron ore began obscuring their surroundings. Lewis describes it as having been, quote, almost like a blizzard seen through a car's windshield in winter. The walls of the mine began slowly disappearing. Next, the floor and the wires began to fade. Even with their cave lights, it got darker and darker. Then, Lewis says, Vlada herself disappeared. This abruptly halted the pair in place. After a harrowing moment or two to get their bearings, the pair decided to continue on, even if, for Vlada, there could be little chance of any useful photographs. Their gamble paid off. The silt eventually cleared as they moved on. The team would later discover that snowmelt from the surface formed a muddy underground river, and this had been the source of their sudden lack of visibility. While ultimately not an issue, it was perhaps the first time that Lewis and the team had encountered unsettling danger in the Bell Island mine. It would not be the last. Although slightly shaken, Steve Lewis, Vlada Dekina, and the rest of the team were excited that the mission was now officially underway. In the coming days, underwater visibility improved. The team soon uncovered a seemingly endless list of underwater marvels. The mine proved to be, as indicated by the old maps, a vast subterranean network of tunnels, galleries, and rooms. The rooms varied in size, from claustrophobically cramped to dozens of meters across. The team also kept finding artifact after artifact, mostly disused tools and pieces of machinery. They also found numerous personal items belonging to mine workers of decades past. They even found spots along the wall where mine workers had used lampblack to write things. These literal cave drawings, which hadn't been seen for at least 50 years, included cartoons, messages, and even memorials for dead workers. Halfway through the 10-day expedition, things were going very well. The dive team continued to make progress exploring and assessing the mine's conditions. It was looking like Bell Island would indeed have an opportunity to open as a tourist adventure attraction, and an incredible one at that. On February 5th, 2007, 2 team members were making their joint way through the mine collecting data. Divers on the mission always traveled in pairs as part of safety protocol. One of them was 51-year-old Joseph Steffen. Steffen was the only American on the mission. Therefore, he was the only one in the group who cared that, back in the US, Super Bowl 41 was currently underway. He was looking forward to getting back to the hotel that evening and hopefully catching an overseas broadcast of the game. At one point, Steffen turned to his dive partner, who happened to be one of the diving safety officers on the mission. He indicated that he would like to return to the surface, but alone. That was strange. It was strictly against protocol for diving partners to split up for any amount of time. According to Steve Lewis, Joe Steffen was an experienced cave diver. He was also ex-military and a career cop. At the time that he made the suggestion that he surface alone, Steffen also still had plenty of air in his tanks. So, what could realistically go wrong in this scenario? Of all the daunting and dangerous tasks that were assigned to this exploratory group, simply swimming back out of the number 2 mine shaft into daylight was probably the easiest. No silt, no tight passageways, and virtually no chance of getting lost. Just swim straight toward the opening. No one at the time saw much of any issue with Joe Steffen making his way out of the mine alone, even though it was technically against protocol. But then, Steffen never surfaced. Baffled and horrified, several team members, including leader Steve Lewis, dove into the number 2 shaft. There, they quickly found Steffen. He was only about 300 feet away from the entrance, at a depth of roughly 50 feet. They motioned to Steffen to get his attention, but got no response. Stunningly, he was unconscious. Lewis and the others carried Steffen's cold, wet body up to the surface. He was rushed to a nearby hospital. A young doctor, who Lewis sympathetically guessed was probably just out of medical school, soon entered the hallway with a clipboard in his hand. With sad eyes, he told Lewis and the others, all of whom were in complete disbelief, that although they had tried everything, they had been unable to save Steffen's life. He was gone. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, this promising diving expedition had taken a severely dark and twisted turn. But what made it even more stunning was the fact that Steffen's sudden death seemed completely impossible to explain. Steffen had somehow met his demise within sight of the exit. He had been swimming through a wide, straight tunnel with plenty of air in his tanks and years of experience under his belt. What possibly could have happened that stopped Steffen in his tracks so close to safety? As fellow divers, friends, and family all grieved, they also awaited the results of Steffen's autopsy. Perhaps some explanation, some answers, some way to make sense of what happened would be found. A few days later, the results came in. And while they definitely shed light on the nature of Steffen's death, they were far from resolving the whole mystery. The autopsy revealed that Steffen had suffered an arterial gas embolism. This is a condition almost exclusive to underwater divers. It is related to an infamous condition popularly known as the bends. When a diver suffers an arterial gas embolism, it means that a nitrogen bubble has appeared inside one of their arteries and blocked it. Still, this was surprising, given that Joe Steffen had only been about 50 feet deep when the embolism apparently struck. How could this have happened to such an experienced and competent diver? Beyond that, why did it happen? Why did Steffen suddenly wish to return to the surface in the first place? Why did he insist on doing it alone? Had something gone wrong? Torturously, his friends and colleagues realized that they would probably never know the answers to these questions. After the bewildering death of Joseph Steffen, the diving team made their sorrowful way back to the hotel. The idea was floated that, in honor of Steffen, the group should all watch the Super Bowl together. It was a touching idea, but according to Steve Lewis, they just weren't in the right state of mind to watch a festive sports game. Instead, they chose another fitting tribute to their fallen friend. They sat around the fireplace and watched Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. That night, many voiced a concern about whether or not the diving mission should continue. Some felt it would be disrespectful to do so. But many others, including Joseph Steffen's wife, Jennifer, felt that Joseph would want the mission to continue. He would want the rest of the mine to be thoroughly explored, and the goal of approving it for tourism to be achieved, even if in his absence. So that is what the team decided to do. As snow threatened to begin falling any minute on Bell Island, Steve Lewis and the remaining team members headed out the very next morning, put their gear back on, and re-entered the mine. Over the next 5 days, the team completed exploring the Bell Island mine. It proved in the end to be even more wondrous and intriguing than any had anticipated. But now, there was another adjective that also applied: deadly. News reporters naturally became much more interested in the exploration of the mine after hearing news of Joseph Steffen's death. The idea that a mine, which had taken the life of a professional diver, was being considered as an open tourist attraction understandably raised some eyebrows. But ultimately, the mission was successful. Today, the newly drained number 2 shaft at Bell Island Mine is open to the general public. Instead of donning diving gear and plunging into a murky abyss, visitors young and old strap on hard hats and walk along pathways laid out by Steve Lewis, Joe Steffen, and the rest of that brave dive team back in 2007. The work they did allowed the disused, largely forgotten site to become a place of education, the honoring of history, and best of all, tourism revenue for the region. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you enjoyed this story and you would like to learn more about it, we highly recommend Steve Lewis's book, Death in Number 2 Shaft. It was a major source used for the creation of this video, and there's a lot more interesting stuff covered in it beyond what we covered today.
Eagle's Nest is one of the most intimidating caves in the entire United States. Located near the coast of West Central Florida, it has been hypnotizing cave divers for years and sadly claimed many of their lives. Like a Bengal tiger, it is both mesmerizingly beautiful and deadly. It is widely regarded as one of the most dangerous cave diving sites, not just in the US, but on the face of the Earth. Particularly named the Mount Everest of cave diving, it is strongly advised that only experienced professionals even consider attempting this site. But amazingly and tragically, as this story will show, even experienced divers can still fall prey to this apex predator of the caving world. Eagle's Nest is actually a sinkhole. Sinkholes are pretty frightening by nature. They are quite literally holes in the earth where the ground simply gave way and collapsed. Sinkholes have several different classifications, and some get created gradually while others collapse all at once. Either way, they often fill with water draining from the surface above, turning into what looks like random little swimming holes drilled into various locations around the globe. The hole in the earth known as Eagle's Nest is about an hour's drive north of Tampa, Florida, and only about 1 mile east off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of Florida's lakes and caving systems are admired and frequently photographed for their incredibly clear and inviting water. Not so with Eagle's Nest. The surface of this sinkhole is notoriously unattractive. For starters, it's green and it's usually covered with algae. There are bugs everywhere, mostly the kind that want to suck your blood, and there aren't really any places to sit and put your stuff. The actual sinkhole is surrounded on all sides by a kind of swampy muck that stretches for many yards in every direction. Shrek would feel right at home here. Perhaps worst of all, the water itself is surprisingly murky. Even if you get your legs muddy and stand directly above it, you can't see what's below. In a way, that's a shame, because it turns out what's below is one of the most extraordinary underwater worlds that humans have ever uncovered. Below the surface of this relatively small and swampy body of water is a labyrinth that descends 300 feet below the Earth's surface. The intricate network of pathways extends for over a mile. According to the experts, it's so amazing that it can actually be unsafe. One expert who says this is Sylvester Muller, who is the vice chairman of the National Speleological Society's cave diving section. He says Eagle's Nest is like a Venus flytrap. You get in there, and there is so much to see you get distracted, and it gets deep quickly. When Muller says there's lots to see, he's not just talking about the amazing network of underwater caves. He's also talking about the life forms that exist inside them. Because of the narrow passages inside Eagle's Nest and the numerous sections that sit in total darkness all the time, unusual animals live inside Eagle's Nest. One is the cave-adapted crayfish. This bizarre creature is as white as a sheet of paper. You can see through its body well enough to see its internal organs from the outside. Most amazingly, for reasons that scientists can't yet fully explain, they can live for as long as 200 years, despite the fact that they're stuck living in dark, maze-like caves such as Eagle's Nest, where there is barely ever any food around. Speaking of science, another reason Eagle's Nest seduces so many divers is because of the highly unusual organic environment. According to National Geographic, things like bacterial cultures and algal mats found here might be good representations of what life could look like on other planets. The cave is a boon for biologists as well as explorers, although surely there is some overlap between the two. The two things on this planet that we've explored the least, and therefore know the least about, are the world underwater and the world underground. Eagle's Nest is both of these worlds combined, making it one of the most alien environments you can ever visit. The event. Needless to say, the appeal of Eagle's Nest is obvious, and it gets many visitors despite being so dangerous. But since the early 1980s, no less than 10 people have died inside Eagle's Nest. In today's crazy world, where it seems like we hear about death and tragedy on the news every single day, that number may not seem as gigantic as it should. In the context of cave diving, a niche sport by nature, one single cave with a death toll in double digits is insane. It's so out of the ordinary that people living on the west central Florida coast have routinely begged for officials to close Eagle's Den permanently. Those calls grew particularly loud following the event that I'm about to describe. On the afternoon of Sunday, October 16, 2016, 3 divers made the trek out to Eagle's Nest in the hopes of exploring its hidden wonders. The 3 were there for a weekend trip, which was supposed to include 3 full days spent diving. They were Chris Rittenmeyer, Patrick Peacock, and Justin Blakely. All 3 were experienced divers, and both Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock had even explored Eagle's Nest before. As they wandered under the shade of the pine trees, they would have seen multiple signs in regards to the sinkhole that was just around the corner. One in particular would have definitely stood out, as I'm sure it does to most people who visit Eagle's Nest. It is a large white sign that says in bold red letters, "Attention Scuba Divers." This sign is a reminder that all divers are strictly required to have completed a registration process before entering Eagle's Nest. In order to register, they must be scuba certified, and they must have the registration papers with them when they visit the area. This is a bold red indication that what you're about to do requires experience and qualification. It would not be the last warning sign the 3 men would see, nor the most disconcerting. Making their way past the sign, the 3 men would have soon come upon a small boardwalk. The boardwalk bridges the way over tall grass and muddy ground until it opens up to the treeless area where the sinkhole sits. Being the 2 in the group who had been there before, Rittenmeyer and Peacock probably went in first. They were intending to explore deeper areas of the cave than Justin Blakely, who was content to explore closer to the surface. There are 3 different tunnels you can take, fanning out somewhat evenly from the central spot where the cave entrance lies. Found along these tunnels are more than 6 dozen rooms, but the biggest and most famous is surely the super room. It's likely that both Rittenmeyer and Peacock would have wanted to explore this portion, meaning they would have had to travel down to the upstream tunnel. There is also a downstream tunnel with more rooms in it. These include the Half Moon Room, Jim's Room, and the Room of Dreams. All three of these are at least 200 or more feet deep. There's a stretch of the cave between Jim's room and another spot called the Pit, where the tunnel dips to 300 feet. It would have areas in the cave such as these that Peacock and Rittenmeyer were exploring together, while their other friend, Justin Blakely, explored higher up. The group reportedly entered the water at around 2 p.m. They had agreed on a meeting point to come back to exactly 1 hour later. As they descended together, they would have quickly run into a sight that is impossible to ignore, a large white sign with the image of the Grim Reaper on it. It seems like there are more than one of these signs in underwater caves around Florida, but it seems entirely possible that Eagle's Nest was the first cave to get that one, and the cave that inspired the disturbing sign in the first place. It says, "Stop, prevent your death, go no further." It then lists some facts about the dangers of cave diving, including the fact that more than 300 divers, including open water scuba instructors, have died in caves just like this one. At the bottom, it says simply and hauntingly, "There is nothing in this cave worth dying for." After exploring the upper regions of the cave, Blakely returned to the meeting point on time. He discovered that he was the only one there. Initially, this probably wasn't too surprising, given that he had been exploring much closer to the surface than Rittenmeyer and Peacock. But after some minutes had gone by, he started to get worried. I'm not sure precisely where the meeting room was, but after a half hour, Blakely returned to it. Once again, he was the only one there. There was no trace of Patrick Peacock or Chris Rittenmeyer. News reports made it sound as though Justin Blakely continued to check the meeting point, then check again, and again, until about 6 p.m., 3 hours after the three friends were supposed to rejoin each other. At 6 p.m., he dialed 911. The aftermath. As you might imagine, Eagle's Nest is one of the worst places to try and look for missing divers. Not only is it incredibly deep, but it is also winding and narrow. It's almost like looking for someone inside the intestinal tract of the earth. Despite rescue crews running to the scene and beginning the search immediately, they looked all through the evening with no luck. The amount of time that had passed at this point sadly left little room for hope. It had been hours since they first descended, and scuba air tanks usually don't last much longer than 1 hour. At the extreme depth of the rooms in Eagle's Nest, that time would likely be shortened even further. The grim search continued until the following morning on October 17th. Given the circumstances, this must have felt like half an eternity. But finally, rescue made the tragic discovery everyone was dreading. The dead bodies of Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock were found relatively close to each other. According to the sheriff's office in the surrounding county of Hernando, the two divers were found both in a very dangerous and complex area of the cave system. Rescue divers estimated that Chris and Patrick were trapped roughly 260 feet below the surface. To put this into perspective, that is only a few stories less than the full height of the Statue of Liberty, and they didn't have a straight shot to the top either. They were buried under a notoriously circuitous network of dark, narrow caves. Final thoughts. This was a horrific, horrific way to die. The story received nationwide media attention, even being covered on CBS Morning News. Like many stories about caving exploration gone wrong, most of the focus was put on the dangers of the cave and the tragic outcome, and as a result, it seems like there is no mystery. Dangerous cave, deadly accident. This seems like an especially complete explanation in the case of Eagle's Den, where it had already happened numerous times before. Clearly, something went really wrong with both Chris and Patrick's dives, but interestingly, on the National Speleological Society's online database, the incident type is listed as unknown. Throughout various news articles, TV segments, and other sources, I did not find a definitive answer as to what actually went wrong. In a cave as challenging as Eagle's Nest, there is quite a lot that could have gone wrong. Perhaps they didn't reserve the amount of gas they needed. Maybe they accidentally knocked around silt or sediment on the floor or walls that obscured their vision. One strong vulnerability in a winding cave like Eagle's Nest is making some kind of a mistake with the guideline they're running. It could be some combination of these factors, or it could be something else. Whatever it was, it trapped Chris Rittenmeyer and Patrick Peacock 260 feet down inside Eagle's Nest and ensured they never saw the light of day again. Do you think Eagle's Nest should be closed to the public? Post your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more caving stories in the near future. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.